Hey guys, tonight we begin beneath your feet, not in the thunder of catacombs or the crumbling grandeur of ruined castles, but in something simpler. You know that soft, earthy smell after it rains, the one that rises from ancient ground and feels like it's exhaling something older than you can name. That's where this story begins. Most people walk across fields and cobblestones without a second thought, unaware that medieval people your quiet, itchy ancestors sometimes whispered to the soil, not in ritual, but in warning. Their curses weren't carved in grand fonts on temple gates or shouted across battlefields. No, they were etched in faint lines onto coins slipped into the graves of nobles, scratched in Latin into lead tablets and thrown into rivers, or scrawled in tight ink along the bottom seam of a reliquary chest. They wanted you not to see them. They wanted only the thief, the desecrator, or the foolhardy digger to read them, which probably includes you by now. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from somewhere strange or sleepy, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're curling up tonight. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself trudging along the outer edge of a ruined chapel wall. The stones are dark, not just from weathering, but from something more reluctant, like they don't want to be remembered. One corner has half a column embedded in the dirt, and there, beneath moss and bird droppings, is a shape that doesn't match the rest. You kneel, brush it. It's a coin, blackened, worn smooth on one side, but the other has something scratched into it. It's not a king's face or a merchant's stamp. It's words, but not words for you. Unless you're not supposed to be here. See, in the 11th and 12th centuries, people didn't just believe in curses, they believed in containment. Wealth wasn't inherently good. It attracted not just envy, but spiritual rot. So they warded it, some with saints' bones, others with more sinister ink. Historians still argue whether these so-called curse coins were real spells, or simply warnings meant to deter robbers. But there's evidence, in burial sites from Britain to Bohemia, of coins with tiny letters, qui me movet, damnabitur. Whoever moves me will be damned. And sometimes, they were in odd materials lead, instead of gold. Symbolic payment for the dead, yes, but also bait. That's what makes this so strange. These weren't amulets to protect the treasure. They were reverse traps, designed to punish the one who found it, and yet they kept finding them. You imagine some poor gravedigger in the year 1191 scraping through cold clay, unearthing a small box filled with what looked like treasure, only to find blackened bones, a rusted dagger, and a small rolled sheet of lead with markings. What does he do? Run pocket the coin, bury it again, but deeper. A document from a Benedictine priory records a monk in Normandy in 1176 who fell violently ill after unsealing a reliquary, a fever that came and went, along with visions of fire. He died within a week. The priory sealed the chest again with wax, holy water, and a tiny note, "Do not touch. The saint is angry." And not all of these messages were in Latin. In Glastonbury, an 8th century casket was found with a coin pouch beneath it. The sack was empty, but the linen had writing, "They took what was not theirs. Let them forget what they love." There's something soft and terrifying about that. Isn't there a curse not for blood or death, but for loss? The loss of joy, of meaning, of memory. Like the treasure wasn't gold, it was the price. You wander further into the field and realize this isn't just about valuables. In fact, most of the cursed objects weren't chests of glittering coins. They were tiny a child's brooch, a silver comb, a carved dice set. Things ordinary people might leave behind, but that carried a part of them, so they cursed them, not out of malice, but for protection. A local legend from the Low Countries tells of a woman who dropped her wedding ring down a well and whispered a curse before walking away. A century later, a boy pulls up a bucket and finds a silver ring clinging to the rope. He wears it. Within days, he loses his sight, not permanently, but enough to fall into the river and nearly drown. He survives, but he never removes the ring. He believes it's what's keeping him alive now. Whether or not you believe him isn't the point. The story was passed down in that village for generations not as proof of magic, but as a warning some things are buried for a reason. It's easy now, in a world of lights and passwords and bank vaults, to forget how dangerous it felt to hold on to wealth back then. You didn't just hide it, you masked it, hexed it, disguised it, or cursed it. You imagine hiding a single coin in a barn's corner, scratching a sigil into the wood, and telling no one, not even your own children, because if they knew, they might take it, and if they took it, the curse would know them. Sometimes, curses weren't meant to protect objects, but places. In Eastern Europe, farmers used to say certain groves were hungry, not in a folktale sense, but literally. Fields would not yield crops. Tools would break. People would forget their tasks. One chronicle from the 13th century notes a town elder in Moravia suggesting that a cursed object was buried beneath a fig orchard after 2 entire harvests rotted without explanation. The townspeople dug beneath a central tree and found a tightly coiled lid figurine with hollow eyes. They reburied it outside the town. The next year, the figs returned. Quirky maybe, but you notice how often these stories start with someone ignoring a small signal. A dog that won't cross a threshold, a candle that won't stay lit, a cold draft from under a church door. Curses, it seems, are less like thunder and more like mold. They creep, they cling, they settle. That's why so many were written in whispers, in hidden text, or on objects you weren't supposed to flip over. The idea was simple: if you see the curse, you've already broken the rule. It's hard to fall asleep with all this, maybe, but then again, maybe that's the point. These aren't the loud stories. These are the ones that come back when you close your eyes. The coin you thought you lost, the trinket under the floorboard, that odd carving on the barn door you've passed 100 times. It's probably nothing, or maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for someone curious enough to reach out and touch it. You trudge deeper into the foggy memory of 13th century Germany, where the soil grows thick around your boots and stories cling to the roots like nettles. The village of Odenbach, quiet even in its heyday, sat near an ancient Roman road forgotten by most, but not by a man named Alaric. He wasn't a knight or a monk. He was a farmer, and not even a lucky one. His fields gave just enough to avoid starvation, and his oxen looked embarrassed to be seen in daylight. One spring, while plowing an unremarkable patch of earth near the edge of a long-abandoned estate, Alaric's plow struck something that wasn't stone and wasn't root. You know the sound, that peculiar metallic grind, like 2 forgotten parts of history remembering each other. He dismounted, dug, and there, wrapped in brittle leather and coated in soil, lay what looked like old Roman coins, hundreds of them, bronze, silver, some with greenish patina that flaked like scales. To you, it might look like a museum display. To Alaric, it looked like freedom. But no one tells bedtime stories about freedom. He didn't tell his wife, not at first. Didn't take them to the village, not yet. He just kept them, tucked them into the back of his barn, hidden beneath rotting hay. And then he started hearing things, scratching, a humming sound in the beams at night. He chalked it up to mice, or maybe wind. But then he found a message, not a dramatic scroll, not a glowing rune, just a short Latin phrase scratched into the back wall of his barn. Caveat avarice, let the greedy beware. The thing is, Alaric couldn't write Latin, and no one in his village had that kind of education. Still, he kept the coins. A few weeks later, his oxen both dropped dead, frothing, no wounds, no explanation. Historians still argue whether this story was based on Alaric himself, or whether it was a folktale that spread through the Rhineland to warn against Roman-era looting. But here's what's weird: local records confirm that in that exact region, several Roman hoards were unearthed by farmers between 1250 and 1270, and more than one of those diggers died suddenly, one from what a priest called fire in the lungs, another who reportedly walked into the woods and vanished. Whether or not the treasure was cursed, the stories of what happened after always seem to follow the same rhythm: discovery, secrecy, decline, and you can see how it starts. You're poor, you find wealth, you hide it, but treasure, real treasure, doesn't sit quietly. It changes the air. Neighbors grow suspicious. The wife notices her husband talking to himself. The dog won't sleep near the barn. Eventually, Alarich, so the legend goes, tried to bury the coins again, in a fresh hole deeper in the forest. But by then, it was too late. He never returned. His wife remarried. The barn collapsed. But even centuries later, children from Audenbach wouldn't play near the old farm path. One boy claimed he saw a man made of smoke watching from the hill. Another said the earth near the barn hissed when it rained. Of course, modern scholars might say the coins were simply contaminated. Roman hoards often carry traces of lead or arsenic, especially if sealed in certain linings. Some even speculate that mold growing on old organic wrappings could have caused hallucinations or illness. But that doesn't explain the writing, or why people avoided the land long after the barn and the family were gone. And this wasn't unique to Germany. Across Europe, similar stories crop up like Moss peasant finds treasure, peasant hides treasure, peasant suffers strange misfortune. You start to realize that in the medieval world, wealth uncovered in secret didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a trap that only pretended to be generosity. In one case from 14th century Belgium, a group of boys found silver rings buried near an ancient well. One boy took one home. That night, his father fell from the hayloft and broke both legs. The next day, their cow died. By day 3, the boy returned the ring and dropped it back into the well, wrapped in a white cloth. A century later, the town priest had the well sealed. You lean into this idea that maybe curses weren't about evil at all. Maybe they were about balance. You take something that wasn't yours, not just legally, but cosmically, and the universe sets things back to equilibrium. Slowly, quietly, with consequences that feel like coincidence until they don't. Quirky details pop up in these stories too, like the fact that in some villages, treasure hunters used to carry a fresh egg in their pocket. If the egg cracked on its own, they believed the ground beneath them was cursed, or the belief in some areas of Ireland that if you found buried coins, you had to leave behind something of equal weight: a tooth, a lock of hair, or even a fingernail. It's disturbingly specific and weirdly consistent across unrelated regions. The funny part, the church rarely took a clear stance on this. On the one hand, treasure belonged to God. On the other, if the church found it, it was conveniently blessed. But if you found it alone, with no witnesses and no permission, that smelled like sin. And sin, as we know, comes with aftershocks. Some monasteries even wrote small prayers of unbinding, short chants to recite if you accidentally uncovered cursed treasure. But no one ever told you what happened if you got the words wrong. Now imagine Alarich again, standing in his cold barn, whispering to coins that don't answer, feeling the walls close in, the oxen gone, the sky flat and heavy. He knows something is wrong, but he doesn't know how to fix it. And you, there beside him, would you keep the treasure? Would you try to cleanse it? Would you dig another hole and hope the earth forgets your name? There's something strange about medieval time, too. Days moved slower, nights stretched longer. When you uncovered something ancient, it didn't feel like old news. It felt like the past waking up. And in some cases, that's exactly what they feared. Because treasure didn't just bring gold, it brought memory. Sometimes memory you didn't ask for. Some stories tell of dreams that came after uncovering buried artifacts, dreams of voices, of languages you never learned, of fire and chanting and marching boots. Not nightmares, exactly. Just intrusions, other people's echoes in your head. Whether you believe that or not, you can see how terrifying it would be to wake up sweating, hearing Latin in your own voice. You can't sleep now. Can you? That's okay. Let your mind drift, like mist curling around those old German woods. Picture the fog swallowing Alarich's footsteps. Picture the coin you hold in your palm, still cold, still whispering, still hungry. You didn't mean to disturb it, but now that it's awake, you wonder if it was ever really asleep. You find yourself wandering through the damp silence of medieval tombs, where stone coffins sleep in rows and the walls feel heavier than the ceiling. There's a chill that doesn't come from air, but from the centuries of warnings etched into the stone. You pass a sarcophagus, simple but stern, and notice something odd, not the carving of the knight on top, sword crossed over chest, but the runes that line the edges in places eyes rarely glance. Some of them aren't decorative. Some say things like, "Do not return what was taken." Others are more direct. "He who disturbs this sleep will not know his own name." You brush a fingertip across the indentations and feel something unsettling, not fear exactly, but a cold intelligence. Whoever wrote these meant them to be read when it was already too late. And in medieval Europe, dead kings and warlords often didn't just take their wealth with them, they took their resentment too. Because in an age where being remembered was power, being disturbed was war. This wasn't superstition for peasants. This was elite fear. Royal tombs weren't just sealed, they were defended, not with swords, but with symbols, stones, and spiritual threats. In Westminster Abbey, for example, several 12th century tombs bear inscriptions designed to invoke divine wrath on anyone who tampered with them. One chilling Latin fragment translates to, "You have touched the veil of God's own soldier, now he shall touch you." In France, the tomb of a local nobleman was discovered to contain a hidden compartment, not for valuables, but for bones. Human bones not his own, arranged in a circle around a lead disc with an unfamiliar sigil. Historians still argue whether this was meant to bind the dead inside or ward off spirits from without. There's something haunting about the fact that no one can agree on what many of these tomb warnings actually mean. Medieval Latin isn't always precise, and regional dialects and mystical symbols complicate the picture. One common phrase, "non revertitur," was long assumed to mean "he shall not return," until some argued it meant "let none return here." The ambiguity was part of the spell. And these weren't decorative additions after the fact, they were embedded in the architecture itself. You imagine masons, eyes downcast, carving protective lines not for aesthetics but for safety. Not their safety. Of course, yours. And sometimes it wasn't even text. Certain tombs had deliberate flaws built into their surfaces, cracks in specific places, misaligned tiles, hollow sections that emitted strange echoes when tapped. A few scholars believe this was part of what they called acoustic defense. If a tomb made noise when approached, the living might think twice. There's a story from 1292 in Milan of a crypt where each step triggered a low groaning hum from the wall. The legend says one thief entered alone, heard it, and clawed his way out screaming that the prince still breathed. No one saw him again. But even more curious were the artifacts placed inside tombs as a sort of spiritual tripwire. Not traps in the physical sense, there's no Indiana Jones boulder waiting, but rather items meant to spiritually bind the tomb. In Eastern European burial chambers, tiny glass jars filled with black liquid were found hidden behind wall crevices. Chemical analysis suggests some were mixtures of pitch, blood, and myrrh. But why hide them? Why tuck them behind a stone panel? Unless the purpose was not preservation, but deterrence. Some believed these were grief phylacteries, objects intended to trap a fragment of sorrow inside, poisoning anyone who dared to disturb it. You pause for a moment, listening to the silence these places preserve. Even your thoughts tread lighter, because in this medieval world, curses weren't melodramatic spells shouted by wizards in towers. They were silent, embedded in stone, waiting. Waiting for the kind of person who touches first and asks questions never. That's the person the dead feared most. Not warriors, not kings, but opportunists, tomb robbers, curiosity merchants, like you, maybe dragging your fingers along the seam of a sarcophagus in some forgotten crypt, listening for a sound that only comes after midnight. And then there's the case of the cadaver tomb's effigies that show the dead not in idealized youth or nightly repose, but as rotting corpses. These weren't meant to terrify. They were reminders, this is where all kings end. Some cadaver tombs had small inscriptions that hinted at more than decay. One reads, "My flesh feeds worms, disturb me, and they will not wait for your death." Funny, maybe, but also not, especially if you knew how these tombs were maintained, frequently sprinkled with blessed ash, or even sealed with a mortar containing crushed bones from plague pits. Whether this was superstition or genuine ritual, no one quite agrees. In one monastery in Austria, a 14th century abbot was buried with a ring of iron nails around his neck. A document left behind claimed it was to bind his thoughts, preventing a restless afterlife. The idea wasn't that the abbot was evil, but that he knew things. That's a recurring theme in tomb curses knowledge. It wasn't just wealth that tombs protected, It was memory, dangerous memory, secrets about rivalries, betrayals, debts unpaid, even affairs. In a world where writing was power and silence was duty, the tomb became a vault not only for the body, but for everything it couldn't say while breathing. Even now, archaeologists tread softly in these places, not because they fear death, but because they've seen how tombs react. Tools malfunction, equipment vanishes, workers report nightmares. It's probably stress, right? Claustrophobia. But still, the stories persist. You lean in, and you can almost hear the stone breathing. It doesn't mind you listening. Just don't take anything. Back in England, there's the infamous case of the Sleeping Knight, buried in the 1200s. His tomb remained sealed until the 19th century, and when it was opened for restoration, inside, workers found not just armor and a sword, but a wooden plaque reading, "You have found him. Now bury what you have become." They laughed it off. A week later, one of the workers fell from a bell tower. Another vanished during a walk. Coincidence? They said, probably was. Probably still is. But the plaque went missing. No record of where it ended up. And somewhere, maybe in a private collection or a museum's basement, it still sits, watching. So now, you imagine yourself back there, in the stone corridors, dust in your throat, candle sputtering. You kneel before a tomb, just curious, just looking. You feel a breeze where, from, there's no opening. You brush your fingers along the carved Latin. It's faded, but you can just make it out. He sleeps to forget. Do not remind him. You pause. The silence deepens. You feel the space thicken. And suddenly, you understand. This isn't a tomb. It's a bargain. You step into a damp corridor beneath an aging abbey in Cornwall, the walls breathing moss and time, the flagstones slick with centuries of silence. Somewhere above, the monks are chanting or maybe just dreaming. Down here, it's quieter, a sort of hush that doesn't feel holy, just watchful. You pause at a wooden door reinforced with blackened iron, the kind of door that doesn't creak because it's too tired. Behind it lies the monastery's silver chalice, at least. That's what the story says. A relic once believed to have held sacred wine, or maybe holy water, depending on which bored scribe was doing the embellishing that day. But this isn't about sacredness. It's about what happened after, because the chalice, though blessed and revered, was whispered to be cursed, not through ritual or theft, but by accident, or so the monks claimed. It starts, like many things, with greed wrapped in virtue. The chalice had been donated by a dying noblewoman in the 12th century, a gift to ensure her place in heaven, or perhaps to cover for the less than Christian things she'd done to secure her wealth. But the monks who received it didn't place it on the altar. They didn't display it at all. They hid it, buried it in the cold vaults, swaddled in cloth, and wrote nothing of it in their ledgers. Why, the story goes that the chalice arrived with a note, a brief one, 7 words. He who drinks forgets, but not safely. That's it. No name, no seal. And yet they believed it, enough to keep the thing out of sight for 200 years. You imagine the first monk who opened the box, expecting something grand, finding a delicate vessel, its rim etched with strange markings, not scripture, not quite symbols, but sharp, angular script that seemed to shift in the candlelight. He probably told no one. Maybe he felt something, a dizziness, a pressure behind the eyes, a tremble in the knees, or maybe nothing happened at all. At first, historians still argue whether the chalice was ever real, or simply part of the abbey's oral legends passed down to discourage younger monks from snooping through the relic room. But it appears again and again in unrelated sources, a merchant's journal from 1314 mentioning a silver cup from the Black Abbey, a pilgrim's account describing a goblet that poisons memory, and a strange parish death record listing a brother Elric as dying of inward vanishing. Whatever that means. The phrase appears nowhere else in ecclesiastical writing, but it appears here, on the margin of the chalice tale, repeated by 3 different scribes. Inward vanishing. And what exactly does that mean? One monk, according to an obscure 15th century letter, claimed that Brother Elric began forgetting faces, not his own, or God's, but the faces of everyone else, one by one. First the abbot, then the cook, then even the Virgin statue in the chapel. He would walk by fellow monks without acknowledgement, stare at icons as if they were stains. Eventually, they say he forgot language, just stopped speaking, sat in the chapel facing the wall, and one morning, his bed was empty. No signs of struggle, just the faint smell of silver polish and candle wax. His robe was found near the vault. You lean closer to the vault door now, running your fingers over the wood grain. There's a small emblem burned into the corner, subtle, almost hidden. A spiral inside a circle, with 7 notches around its edge. It matches a sketch found in a marginal note from a traveling alchemist who passed through the region in 1423. He described being turned away from the monastery, but not before glimpsing a monk scrubbing a silver cup with bare hands while weeping quietly. The alchemist thought it had to do with madness, but you wonder, was it remorse? Or was it the curse? Some theories suggest the chalice had nothing magical about it at all, that it was poisoned literally. Silver can leach toxins if improperly treated, but that doesn't explain the selective forgetting, or why monks believe the chalice didn't kill. It erased, slowly, softly. You can almost imagine the sensation. A memory here, a habit there, words vanishing mid-prayer, faces becoming smudges, not terror, just quiet confusion, the kind of fear that arrives late, long after the damage has started. And the relic wasn't the only thing hidden in that vault. Later excavation records mention fragments of parchment found beneath the shelf where the chalice was reportedly kept. Pieces of a prayer, possibly, but the phrases didn't match any known liturgical text. One partial translation reads, "He who holds what was held will drown in silence." Another, "To forget is mercy, to remember is doom." Kind of poetic, if you're into that sort of thing. Or deeply unsettling if you're holding the cup. Of course, the monks eventually sealed the room. Brick and stone, no door, just a wall where a door had once been. But the outline remains. And stories too. A traveler in the late 1700s wrote of being guided through the abbey ruins by a local boy who refused to approach that wall. Said it made his ears feel like they're turning inside out. The boy's grandmother had told him not to whistle near it, or it would remember your voice. A quaint superstition, or a warning passed down in a village that never read Latin but somehow understood the cost of curiosity. You take a step back now, from the door, from the vault, from the idea that something so small could cause such undoing. And yet, it's the small things that always do. A cup, a word, a name. And what makes the silver chalice so fascinating isn't its supposed power, but the fact that no one ever tried to destroy it. Not once. They feared it, hid it, sealed it away, but no one melted it down. No one threw it into the sea. That tells you something. They didn't just think it was cursed, they thought it mattered. There's a strange reverence to some curses, not in their power, but in their restraint. They don't leap out, they don't attack, they wait. They require you to choose them, to drink from the cup, to read the scroll, to take the coin. That's the scariest part. They let you believe you're in control, and by the time you realize you're not, you can't remember what control ever felt like. So you stand there, heart slow, breath still, and wonder if the vault were open right now, and the chalice stood before you, gleaming faintly in the torchlight. Would you touch it just to see, just once, just to remember what you're supposed to forget? You make your way along a brittle stone path that once saw hundreds of footsteps pilgrims, barefoot and blistered, limping back from the Holy Land with dust in their teeth and relics in their pockets. They walk with pride, with exhaustion, and with a faint fear that they might have brought home more than a souvenir. One of them, a Frenchman named Guy of Chartres, carries something wrapped in oilcloth and prayer, a bone fragment, supposedly from St. George himself, or maybe St. Thomas. Records aren't clear. Either way, it's sacred, fragile, and depending on who you ask, fatally cursed. You wouldn't know it by looking at him. Guy returns to his village like a hero. His neighbors greet him with wine and song. But a week later, his dog is dead, his hands blistered, and he's speaking to shadows that aren't there. Within the month, he disappears into the hills and is never seen again. The relic, still there, in his house, on the table, untouched. It's a classic story, told in soft tones around hearths and monasteries, and not because of its drama, but because of how mundane it is. Pilgrims brought back pieces of the Holy Land as proof of faith, piety, and connection. But faith in the medieval world was laced with danger. Relics weren't just trophies. They were power condensed into bone, wood, or cloth. And power, as everyone knows, doesn't travel well. Some villages in France even had sayings about it. What you bring for heaven may come from elsewhere. In other words, not every relic was what it claimed to be, and some were more than anyone bargained for. Historians still argue whether most pilgrim relics were real, forged, or misidentified. Many were just fragments of unknown origin bones of saints. Yes, but also animals, criminals, even children. One friar from the 14th century noted that too many thumbs of St. Peter circulate among too few shrines. The market was saturated. The faithful didn't always care, but the danger wasn't in the object's origin, it was in its story. If you believed it carried divine energy, then it did. And if you feared it might also carry judgment, well, that happened too. In one well-preserved letter from a Benedictine monk in Rouen, there's a strange account of a group of pilgrims who returned with a splinter from the true cross, supposedly. They placed it in their chapel and offered prayers. But within weeks, crops began to wither, and strange birds circled the village at dusk. The relic was removed, buried, then dug up again by a curious boy. He died of sudden fever that no physician could name. The villagers eventually sealed the fragment in a lead box and dropped it into the river. They didn't want to destroy it, just to forget it, or to be forgotten by it. And these weren't isolated cases. A collection of odd, fragmented accounts across Europe paints a picture that isn't quite cohesive, but shares eerie common threads. Relics that sang in empty rooms, bones that wept black oil, altars that cracked when certain objects were placed atop them. Most were explained away. Of course, humidity, ignorance, rats. But too many monks recorded their unease in marginalia. You know the kind, those sleepy Latin notes tucked in the corners of illuminated manuscripts. You read one and it simply says, "Do not place the relic near bread." No explanation, just a rule, whispered to no one in particular. You imagine a procession of pilgrims returning from Jerusalem, robes worn to threads, eyes hollow from the sun, hands clutching relics wrapped in linen. The townspeople gather, the church bell rings, incense is burned, and as each item is unveiled, a hush falls. Not reverence nervousness, because they've seen this before. The pilgrim who returned with a blessed feather and was struck blind within days. The widow who brought back a relic of St. Catherine's finger and couldn't sleep again for the rest of her life. Curses, if they existed, didn't howl. They tapped, a drop of oil on stone, a candle that refuses to stay lit, the air growing colder in one corner of the chapel, and you wonder, were these curses deliberate, or were they symptoms of misalignment, power in the wrong place? Some theologians from the period hinted at a disturbing theory that sacredness out of context becomes contamination. One bishop wrote that even the blood of saints becomes profane when it crosses the wrong threshold. The Holy Land had rules. Bringing back its artifacts without permission, without purity, was like smuggling lightning in a wine bottle. The bottle might survive the journey. The table it sits on might not. Even stranger are the stories of pilgrims who brought nothing back, but claimed to be cursed anyway. A baker's apprentice from Lyon returns from Rome, empty-handed, but insists a relic touched his shadow. He wakes each night from dreams of fire and hooves. He begins to lose his hair. He stops eating. Eventually, he refuses to speak anything but Latin, and poorly. They say he lived in the church attic until the age of 40, writing the same phrase over and over. It walks still. No one could confirm what it was, but the priest who found his body insisted the writing on the wall changed shape when the light shifted. Quirky, sure, but also eerily consistent. These curses don't explode, they unfold, and the relics once sacred begin to feel like traps disguised as blessings. The very things you pray to become the things that forget you, or remember you too well. One tale from southern England tells of a relic that refused to stay put, a shard of bone, likely from a pig if we're being honest, placed in a chapel and found again in the sacristy drawer the next day, moved again, sealed in a box, returned to the altar. This happened for weeks. Then, one night, it vanished entirely. The next morning, the priest's hand was blistered in the shape of a cross. He left the village. The church was bricked up. The relic, presumably, found a new place to wait. It's tempting to rationalize all of this. Superstition, mold, coincidence. But you don't have to believe in curses to feel them. They exist in stories, passed down like warnings carved into invisible stone. The relics carried by medieval pilgrims weren't just tokens of faith. They were letters to something beyond messages the sender didn't always understand, and the recipient didn't always appreciate. And when those messages were misdelivered, mishandled, or simply misplaced, well, things happened. You stand now in an empty chapel, the kind with cracked glass and walls that still remember incense. A shelf rests in the corner, dust thick enough to write your name in. You don't. You stare at the tiny bundle wrapped in cloth, forgotten beneath the altar. You could open it. Just a peek. Just a one. But you remember the words you read once in a manuscript gloss. The hand that unwraps is the soul that vanishes. You don't know if it's true, but you're not quite curious enough to find out. You walk along the edge of an old village cemetery, the ground soft with centuries of secrets, the air thick with that particular stillness only the forgotten know how to keep. Stone markers lean like drunks who gave up standing straight, names half erased by rain and time. But you're not looking for the grand crypts or ornate crosses. You're looking for the ones with no names, just worn stones and sunken earth. Because buried in these places aren't only the dead, but the unwritten rules of the living. You step past a broken gate, boots sinking into the loam, and imagine what it was like to be the one holding the spade, the medieval gravedigger anonymous, dirt-streaked, half respected and half feared. He knew something others didn't, not about death, but about what followed. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the role of the gravedigger was both sacred and dangerous. He handled the threshold between the world of breath and the world beneath. And in small towns where everyone knew everyone, the digger knew too much. He saw what was buried with the body's rings, coins, relics, sometimes even weapons, wealth most people would kill for, or die with. But he didn't take it. Not just out of fear of punishment, out of fear of consequence, because stories spread, whispered, unrecorded, but carried from one gravedigger to the next like a torch. You kneel beside one unmarked grave and see it half buried in the mud, a coin with a faint image barely visible beneath corrosion, not gold, not even silver, just copper, dark and strange. Its edges are carved in a crooked pattern, like someone scratched them in anger. You remember a phrase from a Scottish chronicle, "They sleep with eyes open who sleep with wealth," and gravediggers knew this better than anyone. That's why many of them took oaths, spoken to no one but the wind or the god they hoped was listening. Oaths not to steal, not to touch, not to covet. Historians still argue whether such oaths were formal or merely local customs, but evidence in parish records hints at them. Phrases like, "He kept the soil's silence" would appear in death notices for the known grave workers. Some graveyards had stones carved not for the dead, but for the living silent reminders near the gate. What lies beneath, let lie. And for those who broke the unspoken pact, punishment was rarely from the law. It came in other forms. One 13th century folktale from Flanders tells of a digger who pocketed a ring from a fresh grave. He wore it for a week. On the 7th day, he lost his hand. Not to violence. It simply blackened and fell away. The story ends with him whispering apologies into the dirt before vanishing into the forest. And what about the coins themselves? Why would anyone bury them? You think of the medieval fear of the soul's journey. Some coins were meant for passage not to the underworld, but to ease the burden. Others were symbols of unfinished debts. One monk wrote that the dead carry their weight unless paid. Still others believed that coins buried with the body were a way of chaining them to silence. Payment, yes, but also a seal. You remove the coin, and maybe the silence breaks. Then there's the strange tradition of earth money coins that were never meant to be spent, only buried, crudely stamped, often bent, and sometimes marked with strange symbols like suns, spirals, or unfamiliar runes. No record of these coins exists in standard royal mint logs, yet they appear again and again in cemeteries, hidden near wrists or under tongues. Were they tokens of safe passage or warnings? You wonder what happens when one is taken not by archaeologists, but by a careless hand. Does the silence follow you, or does something else? One peculiar case in Bohemia tells of a young grave digger who took a coin from a child's grave, a small bent token wrapped in decaying ribbon. He kept it in his pocket. Within days, he claimed he could no longer dream, or rather, he could no longer remember his dreams. Every night, he would fall asleep and wake up breathless, as if he'd been somewhere but couldn't say where. He tried to return the coin, dug back the grave, but the earth refused to open. The soil, he said, had closed with a mouth. Eventually, he buried the coin at a crossroads. A year later, a stone cross appeared at that exact spot, erected by no known villager. It simply was. Some say curses linger in objects, others say they linger in intention. The gravedigger's oath, in this light, becomes a protective veil, not against ghosts or spirits, but against himself. To dig a grave is to touch a story as it ends. To steal from that story is to rewrite it, and rewriting comes with a price. You sit now beside a grave with no marker, no memory, and yet the grass grows taller here than anywhere else. Maybe it's nothing, or maybe someone broke a promise here, long ago, and the earth has been trying to forget ever since. And it's not just coins, rings, brooches, small daggers, things buried by request or necessity. The gravedigger sees them all. Some asked for their treasures to be buried with them. Some were buried with treasures they never earned, and the digger knew which was which. That knowledge, I'll wait. Maybe that's why some of them went mad, or vanished. In the town of Morlaix, a 14th century burial register notes 4 successive gravediggers, all leaving the post within a single year. One reportedly walked into the sea. His last written note, just 3 words he whispered back. You might scoff, you might call it myth, but when myth repeats across languages, across borders, across centuries, it starts to feel less like fiction and more like warning disguised as poetry. The job of the medieval gravedigger was not just to bury, but to respect the final terms of a life. Disturb those terms, and something disturbs you. You press your palm into the earth now, over that nameless grave. The ground is soft, too soft, as if it's still unsettled. You feel the pulse of roots and time, the hush of something listening. You don't say anything. You just breathe, because even now, with no one watching, part of you remembers you are not the only one who keeps vigil here. You run your thumb across the edge of a coin, small, tarnished, unremarkable. At first glance, it's just another relic of medieval trade, the kind you'd find in a forgotten drawer, or beneath a centuries-old floorboard. But then, the light hits it at the right angle, and you notice something odd, a faint groove, darker than the rest, not from wear, but deliberate, like a scar intentionally drawn. Locals used to call these whisper coins. You flip it over, and there it is, a blackened edge, slightly raised, as if the metal resisted the mold that formed it. To the medieval mind, this wasn't a manufacturing error. This was a message, a curse, a warning that the coin had a voice, and if you listened too long, it would speak to you. It sounds absurd now, in a world of credit cards and blockchain, but back then, coins carried more than value. They carried stories, affiliations, memories, and occasionally, they carried something no one could explain. You walk through a marketplace in 14th century Bruges, the air thick with garlic, smoke, and the stink of too many bodies pressed too close. You approach a vendor selling apples and bread, and as you hand over a coin, she freezes, looks at it, then at you, then slips the coin into a pouch far from the rest. She doesn't explain. She just nods and offers your change in a different denomination. That's how you find out your coin whispers back. There were entire legends surrounding these coins. Some were said to hum at night. Others reportedly felt warm, even in winter. One 15th century merchant in Ghent kept a ledger of strange happenings tied to certain coins. One caused his ink to smear, no matter what parchment he used. Another made the candlelight flicker only when it was near. He eventually buried them in separate corners of his cellar and swore to never spend anything minted in years, ending with 3. No one knows why. The cellar still exists, and so do the coins, though the new owners claim they've never touched them. Probably wise. Historians still argue whether these coins were simply anomalies, off-center strikes, flawed alloys, local superstitions, or whether they represented something deeper. Some believe the blackened edge was symbolic of theft, that the coin had once been used in an unholy transaction, like paying for a betrayal or bribing a priest to keep quiet. Others think they were part of a secret network, marked intentionally by certain groups, early thieves guilds, or occultists, like a reverse calling card. But the most curious theory is the simplest, that the coins remembered, not with minds, but with presence, that some trace of their history remained, clinging to their shape, passed along with every hand that touched them. You picture a coin like that, resting in the bottom of a beggar's purse, passed from palm to palm across decades. Maybe it was once part of a dowry stolen in the night. Maybe it bought the silence of a monk who knew too much. Maybe it was simply lost and resented being found. Whatever the case, it now carried a weight that went beyond its worth, and people felt it. They'd spend it quickly, pass it to children or strangers, just to be rid of it. One chronicler noted that a black-edged coin never buys bread twice, an eerie way of saying it never stayed long in one hand. In Prague, an entire market stall was once abandoned after a merchant claimed her coin spoke when left overnight. She heard them whispering, not in language, but in sound, like dry leaves brushing against skin. She moved her stall. No one took her place. The building was torn down a century later. Workers said the soil underneath was laced with copper pieces, all with black edges, none matching any known mint. They were carted away, and what happened to them? Well, you're holding one now, aren't you? You keep walking, past booths and barrels, down to the edge of the town square. There, a fountain trickles quietly, its stone chipped and lichen covered. You remember another tale, this one from a town in southern France, where villagers would toss coins into a sacred spring for luck. But one coin, a single black-rimmed token, was said to turn the water bitter. No algae would grow near it. No birds would drink. The villagers eventually emptied the basin, removed the coin, and buried it beneath a church. Within a week, the church bell cracked during Mass. Coincidence? Maybe. But they melted that bell down and never used that spring again. It's not just the coins themselves that mattered. It was how people treated them. Superstition created the curse, perhaps, but belief made it real. A tanner's apprentice in Lubeck once painted the edge of a coin black, as a joke, handed it to his friend. The friend tripped that afternoon and cracked 3 teeth. The joke soured. The coin was thrown into the fire, but in the ashes, it remained unburned, bent, but not melted. The tanner left town. The apprentice became a monk, or so the records claim. His name vanishes after that. And here's where things get even stranger. Some people didn't fear these coins, they collected them. A niche class of medieval nobles and scholars who believed that the coins could grant visions, or insight, or power. They built collections, kept them in sealed boxes, and swore to never let them touch each other, because if they did, they might remember together, and no one wanted to see what that looked like. One collector, a minor baron with a taste for alchemy, was said to have died with one such coin in each hand. His eyes were open, mouth smiling, as if he had heard something delightful just before the end. You turn the coin in your hand again. It's still cold, still quiet, but the room around you feels different now. A little too still. Like the coin is waiting for you to decide, will you keep it? Will you pass it along? Or will you bury it somewhere deep and forget you ever found it? Coins are just metal, sure, but in the medieval world, metal remembered. It came from the ground. It went through fire. It carried the fingerprints of kings, thieves, lovers, and liars. And sometimes, when the edges darkened and the groove shifted just so, it carried more than memory. It carried intent, not yours, not even the one who made it, but the one who marked it long after, in the hope that the coin would outlive them. It did. And now, it's here, listening. So you slip the coin into your pocket, feel its weight settle against your leg, and wonder not for the first time what it wants. Not from history, but from you. You find yourself hunched over a parchment map in a flickering candlelit study, the kind of map that doesn't point north so much as it points inward, not made for navigation, but for remembrance. Medieval maps, especially the strange, half-esoteric ones, aren't meant to get you anywhere practical. They're riddled with dragons, saints, strange beasts, and cryptic symbols that no compass understands. And among the castles, rivers, and holy sites, you begin to notice something more curious. Small marks, often triangles, crosses, or concentric circles with jagged teeth. These aren't landmarks. These are warnings. You lean closer, tracing the edge of one weather-warped chart from 1286, and your eyes land on a simple red X, drawn not at sea, but on dry land, just outside the margins of a village. Beside it, a single Latin word, maledictum, cursed. You don't find that sort of thing on modern maps, but in the medieval world, not all treasure was meant to be found, and not all ground was meant to be walked on. Cartographers, especially the monastic ones, knew this. They included symbols not for utility, but for silence. A map, after all, is a kind of story, and sometimes the most important stories are about places best left alone. These cursed symbols, called by some historians hex marks, appear across dozens of medieval charts, some near ruins, others near forests, and a few near nothing at all. Just blank parchment space that might once have meant something, but had long since been erased. Historians still argue whether these symbols were meant to mark sites of real danger buried relics, plague pits, desecrated tombs, or whether they were spiritual shorthand. This land carries a weight we don't understand. What's most unsettling is how consistent they are. You find the same jagged cross on a map from Milan in 1302, and again on a Yorkshire monk's sketch from 1271. Different languages, same warning. Like the knowledge traveled underneath language, passed hand to hand, monk to monk, gravedigger to cartographer. And then there are the treasure maps, not fairy tale scrolls with dotted lines and cartoon pirates, but cryptic diagrams scrawled on the backs of land deeds, tucked into herbals, or hidden between pages of bestiaries. Some describe routes using landmarks that no longer exist. Others give clues like where the dog will not bark, dig one pace west. A chilling one reads, under the cursed elm, behind the maiden stone speak nothing, or be followed. You read that and smile, or you try to, because the map you're reading looks an awful lot like a warning dressed as curiosity. You think back to a strange story from Saxony. A 14th century monk discovered a map tucked inside a wooden reliquary box. It led, supposedly, to a buried cross once carried by a penitent knight. The monk followed it, whether out of piety or greed isn't clear. What is clear is what happened after. He returned to the abbey barefoot, silent, and refused to eat. He died 3 days later, but not before carving a symbol into his bedframe, a circle surrounded by jagged teeth. The same symbol from the map. His belongings were burned. The map hidden again. Where? No one knows. Not all hex marks were about treasure, though some marked places where something had been buried, not gold, but memory, shame, secrets. In the Pyrenees, villagers whispered of a meadow marked with a red line on a local map. Not a boundary, but a place no animals would graze. Local shepherds said the earth there breathed wrong. Later accounts describe bones unearthed there, wrapped in lead sheets, etched with curses against betrayal. The names had long since worn away. The mark remained. You feel a strange tension in your fingers as you trace one such symbol on the map before you. It's small, easy to miss. A blackened square near the base of a river. There's no town, no church, nothing labeled, but the square has a line through it. And if you believe certain chroniclers, that line meant one thing. buried regret. Not treasure, not punishment, just a warning that something still waits. Not to be found, just to be left alone. A quirky detail arises from some surviving journals. People who attempted to follow cursed maps often brought charms. Not swords, not tools, charms, dried herbs, small saint figurines, wax figures. In some cases, they hired blind guides. Why blind? Because sight, in these matters, was considered a liability. If you saw the thing you weren't meant to find, it could see you back. One grim account from a merchant in Naples tells of hiring a mute child to carry a map while he walked 20 paces ahead. The child died in his sleep 2 days later. The merchant lived, but he never went near a marked map again. Some scholars believe hex marks were also mnemonic devices, ways to remember not where treasure was, but where something happened. A betrayal, a disappearance, a debt unpaid, places soaked in narrative. The mark wasn't for you. It was for them, for those who already knew the story. But if you stumbled across it, well, you were now part of the story too. Welcome. It's easy to get romantic about all this. Maps, mystery, coded warnings. You picture a lone traveler with a hooded cloak, descending into forgotten valleys, guided by cryptic ink and intuition. But the truth is far quieter. Most who followed these maps didn't die dramatically, they just didn't come back. Or worse, they did, changed. You read descriptions of survivors hollow-eyed, paranoid, suddenly devout, or suddenly mute. And then you understand maybe the curse wasn't the treasure. Maybe the curse was the map itself, a piece of paper that wants to be followed, that invites you to seek what it has already buried for a reason. You step back from the table. The candle's flame bends slightly, as if breathing. The map rustles not from wind, but from its own memory. You could roll it up, burn it, leave it, or you could follow it, just to see. You tell yourself you'll stop if anything feels wrong, but that's the problem, isn't it? These places don't feel wrong, they feel forgotten, and that's how they survive. One last detail catches your eye, a note written sideways in the margin of the map, almost a joke, or a test. It reads, "If you're reading this, the map has found you." You pause. Your skin chills. You hadn't noticed that before. Maybe it was there all along, or maybe it only appears once you've read enough to care. So you fold the map, you press your palm to the parchment. It feels warmer than it should. Somewhere, in a field marked only by an old elm and a stone worn smooth by rain, something waits, not for gold, not for glory, just for someone like you. Someone who doesn't believe, not yet. You arrive at the outskirts of a sun-bleached Italian village where the air tastes faintly of dust and old stone, and every alley seems to curl back into itself like a cat settling into sleep. This is the kind of place where names last longer than people, where rumors don't fade, they ferment. And here, tucked behind a leaning chapel wall, lived the widow Elena. Her name survives in parish ledgers, and one surviving prayer request scribbled in faded ink: "Pray for the soul of Elena de Bruna, who gave, who waited, who wept." But what she left behind, the thing no one touched, the thing that earned quiet looks and closed shutters, was her dowry chest. A small thick oak box bound with iron straps, wrapped in a velvet cloth no one dared remove. And the story they tell is simple. The chest was cursed, not by a witch, not by a priest, but by the widow herself. It began, as these things often do, with love. Elena was betrothed young, promised to the son of a wine merchant whose fortunes came and went with the harvest. They were to marry in spring, but winter brought war, or plague, or something worse. It depends which version you hear. What matters is the groom never returned. Some say he fled, others say he died. Elena waited, for a month, for a year, for 5. Her chest, the dowry prepared by her mother's hands, remained sealed. Inside it, jewelry, linens, family heirlooms, and, according to whispered accounts, a tiny clay idol, one she placed there herself, quietly, late one night, after kneeling in front of the chest for hours. No one knows where the idol came from. Some claim it was Etruscan, Others insist she made it herself from soil near the family grave plot. But one thing they all agree on after she placed the idol inside, the chest was never opened again. Historians still argue whether the idol was an act of grief, protection, or vengeance. Some believe it was a symbolic offering, a gesture of closure. Others suggest something darker, that Elena, abandoned and disgraced in the eyes of her village, placed a curse not just on the chest, but on the idea of her marriage, sealing it inside forever. A quiet kind of fury, the kind you whisper when you're tired of crying. And here's where the tale shifts from tragedy to unease. Because after the chest was sealed, strange things began to happen. First, the animals. Elena kept goats, good-natured, noisy ones. But after the idol was placed, they stopped making noise, just stood there, blinking, as if something unseen had muted them. Then came the lights. Soft flickers at night from her window, though no candles were lit. Children passing by claimed they heard a voice, not crying, not screaming, just whispering. One boy said it was the chest itself, reciting the same phrase over and over, in a language he didn't understand. He had a fever for 3 days afterward. When he recovered, he refused to walk past Elena's house again. Even when she died, no one approached the chest. The priest refused to bless it. The neighbors refused to move it. So it sat, decade after decade, in the corner of the crumbling house, covered in dust and velvet. You picture the box now, maybe a little smaller than you imagined, a bit warped by time, but still intact. You imagine lifting the cloth, your fingers trembling. What would you find? The linens, the jewelry, or the idol, cold and patient, waiting for someone new. A scholar who visited the village in the 19th century described seeing the chest. He didn't touch it, but noted that the room smelled faintly of almonds and something he described as regret. He sketched the iron lock and left. His note stopped mid-sentence. The next entry in his journal is dated 4 weeks later, from a different country, and begins simply, "I have forgotten something, but it's better that way." Quirky as it sounds, clay idols weren't entirely uncommon in southern Europe. They were used for fertility, for mourning, for luck, but rarely were they sealed inside boxes, and never in dowry chests. This was a symbol of beginning, of union. To curse a dowry was to curse the life that never happened. In a way, Elena inverted the tradition. She turned the hope chest into a tomb, not for her love, but for the hope itself. And the village, whether they believed or not, respected that silence. No one dared to repurpose the chest. No one scavenged its contents, not because of the curse, perhaps, but because it felt personal. Like violating it would be an act of cruelty against someone whose suffering had already echoed far too long. One odd detail stands out. A midwife in the village, many years later, claimed that Elena once asked her for a small bag of herbs valerian, mugwort, and yew bark. She assumed it was for sleeping troubles, but yew is toxic, especially when burned, and according to one legend, the idol was baked with those herbs pressed into its clay, a scent that would have infused it with something more than earth, something unsettled. Some say that's why the goats went silent, why the children had fevers, why no one could explain the noises. Whatever had been bound inside that chest wasn't asleep. It was just listening. Now, centuries later, the house still stands, barely, roof sagging, walls split like old bread, but the chest, still there. Locals avoid the street after sunset, not out of fear, they say, but out of respect, as though Elena's pain still haunts the corners of their memory, like a candle that refuses to gutter out. A few brave travelers have gone to see it. Some report nothing. Others claim they dream of a room filled with boxes, all sealed, all whispering. You sit at the foot of her ghost house now, staring up at the window where the flickers used to dance. The shutters hang crooked. The curtain is gone, but you can feel the pull. Not malevolent, not seductive, just a quiet question. Will you open it? You shake your head, not out of fear, out of understanding. Some things are closed for good reason. Curses, you realize, aren't always grand displays of wrath or vengeance. Sometimes they're quiet, intimate, A seal placed not to punish, but to preserve. Not every curse is about pain. Some are about memory, how to hold it, how to bury it, how to make sure no one digs it up again. Elena's chest was never meant to hurt anyone. It was meant to hold something she couldn't carry anymore. And that, in its own strange way, might be the most dangerous kind of curse, the one wrapped in grief, preserved in silence, and left behind not to haunt, but to endure. You walk now into the bitter clang and glow of a medieval forge, hot, metallic, and always half a breath away from thunder. The air here isn't just smoky, it's thick with ritual, with motion, with repetition that borders on incantation. You watch the blacksmith work one hand steady on the hammer, the other guiding iron into forms no common eye would notice as strange. But these aren't horseshoes or hinges, these are seals, iron discs, etched with symbols that aren't family crests or church marks but something older, symbols not made to be seen, not meant to be recognized. These are curse seals, and the smith isn't just crafting them, he's binding them into hinges beneath castle floors, into boxes buried under thresholds, into locks no key is supposed to open. Unlike priests or scholars, blacksmiths dealt with the raw world fire, earth, blood, and sweat. They were feared for it, respected for it, sometimes even avoided for it. In many villages, the blacksmith's forge sat at the edge of town, close enough for necessity, far enough for suspicion, because everyone knew they made more than tools. They made containers. That's what they called them. Not chests, not boxes, containers. Something that holds something else. But what exactly were they trying to hold to? Historians still argue whether these curse boxes were practical traps or spiritual safeguards. Some say they were created to house cursed items, coins, bones, fragments of scandal. Others say the boxes themselves were the curse, crafted with exact measurements, layered with ash, wrapped in symbols drawn backward, sealed not with nails, but with wax mixed with blood. And when they were buried, usually at crossroads, beneath the doorsteps, or in the foundations of towers, they were meant to stay closed. Forever. You imagine one such seal now, rough to the touch, iron turned dull by the years. On one side, a spiral on the other, a line that seems to divide the piece into two silent halves. The smith who made it didn't sign his work. None of them did. It wasn't pride. It was fear. Fear that naming yourself would link you to the seal's power. So the blacksmiths operated in a different kind of silence. Not monastic silence, functional silence, the kind of silence that knows what happens when iron remembers. There's a recorded instance in southern France of a smith named Thibaut, who sealed a box meant to contain a noble's guilt, gold coins taken during a siege that left hundreds dead. The noble, riddled with nightmares and guilt, paid Thibaut to make a box and seal the gold away in the floor beneath his estate. Afterward, Thibaut was paid a second time not to keep quiet, but to forget what he'd made. He tried, but 6 months later, Thibaut was found dead in his forge, his mouth blackened, one hand wrapped around a lump of molten iron. The gold was never recovered. The house was sold. It burned 2 years later. No one rebuilt. And that's just one story. You find others, dozens of them, in scattered fragments. A forged receipt that lists a sealing plate with double notch. A monk's letter describing a box that should never be warmed. A farmer's tale of an iron square dug up from his orchard that made his livestock sick until it was reburied. Always the iron. Always the intention to contain. You start to understand why smiths were called upon not only to arm the living, but to cage the dead, or worse, the memories the dead didn't want to take with them. Sometimes the smiths worked in pairs, one for the shaping, one for the carving. In certain German towns, the carver wasn't allowed to speak once the first line was etched, not until the box was buried. This wasn't ceremony, it was protection, because belief matters. If you know what you're sealing, it can find you. But if your job is only to shape the iron and say nothing else, maybe you can walk away untouched. Maybe. A curious side note comes from a 14th century English guild ledger, which lists several apprentices under the title ferromancer, a term never officially explained, but one that appears only in relation to sealing work. Some scholars think it meant iron whisperer, Others believe it was simply a way to separate ordinary smiths from those who specialized in containment. But the tools they used, unusual: thin chisels with hooked edges, molds shaped like mouths, tongs made not for grasping, but for pressing impressions into soft metal that hardened like skin. You don't know whether to be fascinated or uncomfortable, maybe both. You hear of one blacksmith, anonymous, who was commissioned to seal a relic inside a monastery wall. He agreed, took the object never described, and placed it in a small iron cube. Before sealing it, he reportedly whispered a phrase in a language no one recognized. Then he shut the box and walked out of the village. No record of his name, no record of his origin, just the cube, still lodged in the stone, and a local tradition that says if you press your ear to that part of the wall, you'll hear breathing. No one does it twice. And what about the castles, the grand estates? You'd think those lords and ladies wouldn't entertain such peasant magic, but they did. In fact, the wealthier the household, the deeper the fear. One noble family in Austria embedded iron curse seals beneath every hearthstone of their estate, each marked with the name of an ancestor, not to honor them, to pacify them. It's said they feared their lineage would rebel from the grave if certain secrets ever came to light. Which ones, no one knows. The estate was abandoned during a famine. Some say it was coincidence. Others say the seals weren't enough. You stare at the forge now, embers glowing like angry eyes. The hammer rests, cooling, beside a pile of twisted filings. The anvil is stained not with soot, but with something darker, and you wonder what it felt like to be a smith asked to make something you didn't believe in until it started watching you. You imagine holding one of those boxes, feeling it vibrate slightly, like a heartbeat that isn't yours. You imagine sealing it, burying it, walking away and spending the rest of your life listening for its return. Iron, they believed, was incorruptible, that it bound demons, stilled spirits, suppressed magic. But the catch was this iron also remembers. Once shaped, it carries intention. It becomes not just metal, but message. And if you don't seal it right, if you rush, or speak, or think too clearly about what's inside the message leaks. That's why the seals are so crude, so blunt. They weren't meant to be admired. They were meant to be forgotten, like the blacksmiths who made them, like the things they tried to lock away. So now, centuries later, you dig beneath a ruined tower. Your spade hits metal. You kneel, brush the soil aside. There it is, an iron seal, rusted but intact. You feel the weight of it before you even lift it. Cold, heavy, humming faintly with something older than language. You know what it is. You know what it was made to do. But now it's in your hands. And the forge is long cold. You walk beneath the leaning eaves of a crumbling manor house in Flanders, the stone warped and weeping with lichen, the shutters trembling on rusted hinges. It's not the sort of place that stands abandoned because no one wants it. It's the kind that stands because no one dares take it. The grass grows too evenly. The windows reflect a little too much. And inside, past the collapsed doorway and the scent of rotting wood, lies what no one ever claimed an inheritance. Not a metaphorical one, a literal estate, land, wealth, rooms filled with tapestries and hand-carved wardrobes, and more than one hidden compartment. And yet, for over 200 years, not a soul has stepped forward to claim it. You wonder why? Then you remember you're in the house of the Van Mertens family, and that name, even now, still makes the villagers lower their voices. The Van Mertens weren't villains. Not on paper. Wealthy, yes. Reclusive, certainly. But what terrified people wasn't how they lived. It was how they died. Or rather, how they disappeared. One by one. Over generations. Not in fires or plagues or war, but in silence. Each heir a little more withdrawn than the last. Each one vanishing with less explanation. The first left behind a sealed letter with no writing inside. The second left no body. The third left a mirror face down on the dining room table. And the fourth, well, no one remembers the fourth. Not really. There's a painting of her, hanging in the upstairs hall, but her name isn't on any record. Locals call her the one the house forgot. And then there's the inheritance. The documents remain, sealed chests, bound ledgers, titles, deeds, inventories, all untouched, all unclaimed. After the fifth disappearance, the crown attempted to auction the estate, but every buyer either withdrew or vanished themselves. A merchant from Bruges tried to claim it in 1621. His ship sank in calm weather. A banker in 1694 sent men to survey the land. None returned. Finally, in quiet bureaucratic exasperation, the estate was declared inhospitable. No one owns it. No one taxes it. No one enters. Historians still argue whether the Van Mertens estate is cursed, haunted, or simply cursed by memory. One theory suggests a series of hereditary illnesses. Another proposes a string of particularly bad luck, amplified by a local legend. But the coincidences pile up too precisely. A recurring number etched in different rooms, 23. A repeated phrase in several letters, "It will not rest until it is forgotten." And the most unsettling detail of all, every heir kept a journal. And in each, at some point, the entries end mid-sentence, as if stopped by something faster than thought. You stand in what was once the library, shelves warped from moisture, spines melted into one another like wax. A pile of books lies collapsed near the hearth, and among them, a single letter, folded, unsealed. You open it carefully, and there it is again. It will not rest until it is forgotten. No signature, no date, just the phrase, ink slightly smeared, but legible. You wonder who wrote it, or if everyone did. Among the town's oral history, one detail remains oddly consistent. The house was built over something, a foundation older than the family itself, possibly Roman, possibly pre-Christian. Workers during the initial construction reported digging up iron chains embedded in the earth chains that led nowhere, attached to nothing. The story goes that the architect insisted on building over it anyway, that to remove the chains would unfasten memory, whatever that meant. The chains were never removed. They're still there, supposedly, buried under the east wing, which collapsed in the 1800s during a thunderstorm with no rain. It's not uncommon. You realize, for legends to attach themselves to powerful families, but most legends aim for drama duels, betrayals, bloodlines. The Van Mertens legend is quieter, slower. It's not about punishment. It's about erosion, like the family line was being eaten from the inside. Not all at once, just memory by memory. One generation loses its appetite, the next forgets birthdays, the next can't remember the name of the house cat, until eventually, they forget to be afraid. And that's when it takes them. One cryptic note, found inside a ledger dated 1543 reads, "The box is not empty. It remembers when it was full. The box is never described, but it appears in multiple entries across multiple decades, always referred to as if it's obvious, as if the reader knows what box." One entry says, "Do not open the box in a mirror's presence." Another, "The box dreams now." It should not. Scholars suggest it might refer to a reliquary or a sealed family archive, but no one has ever found it. Or rather, perhaps no one remembers that they did. A more recent visitor, a skeptical historian from Ghent, reported entering the estate with a flashlight and notebook. He stayed exactly 2 hours. When he returned, he said nothing of what he'd seen. He simply mailed his notes to a colleague and moved to Venice. His colleague opened the envelope to find 15 blank pages and a photograph of a window. No writing, just the window, and in its reflection, a faint silhouette of someone standing behind him. The historian refuses interviews to this day, and maybe the strangest part, the family line isn't officially extinct. Somewhere out in the world, a Van Mertens descendant may still live, unaware, detached from the estate's gravity by distance and time, and if they ever return, if they ever try to claim the inheritance, what waits? Not wealth, not power, but memory, not their own. Perhaps just the houses. You sit now in the ruined dining room, the table long gone, the walls bowed inward like they're tired of standing, but the dust still forms patterns, letters, numbers, faces. If you squint, the inheritance, you realize, was never gold. It was the weight of something remembered too long, something that doesn't want to be remembered anymore, something that punishes those who won't forget. In the corner of the room sits a tall chest, unopened. The lock is simple. You could open it. You could be the one to see what none of the heirs would. But your hand hesitates, because this isn't curiosity anymore. It's invitation. And whatever's inside that box, that legacy has been waiting. Not for you, for anyone. You rise. You walk out. Past the window where the reflection lingers half a second too long. Past the stair that creaks in a rhythm, like footsteps behind you. Past the gate that sighs as it closes. You don't look back, because you understand now. Some houses aren't haunted by ghosts. They're haunted by names. And this one is still waiting to be inherited. You descend now into the underbelly of a medieval city where sunlight never quite arrives, and the air feels so still. It might be holding its breath beneath the bustling cobblestone streets of Bruges, or maybe it was Lyon. The story changes depending on the telling. There runs a network of catacombs so narrow you must twist your shoulders to pass, so dark that lanterns seem swallowed by the black. And here, beneath vaulted arches slick with centuries of condensation, lie the debtors, not in a figurative sense, not as a metaphor for societal burden, but literally the poor, the exiled, the imprisoned, those who died owing silver or bread or allegiance, the forgotten dead, their bones tucked into corners, stacked with more care than reverence, marked only occasionally with names, but sometimes, more chillingly, with curses, because in this city, the unpaid do not rest quietly. You find one of them now, a femur tucked beneath a carved symbol, a looping knot that doesn't match any known Christian mark. Beneath it, scratched into the wall, let no man spend what was mine. A curse, a statement of grief. You can't be sure, but the atmosphere answers your hesitation. The catacombs feel thicker here, the temperature suddenly colder, the stone sweating like it remembers. According to the city's lesser-known records, these catacombs were once used by a local guild tasked with debt reconciliation, part scribe, part priest, part accountant, when someone died without repaying what they owed. Their name and the amount was written into a long scroll, sealed in a jar, and buried with the body. Some of these jars were wrapped in linen, others in iron bands. And the belief was simple: if you disturb the jar, the debt would transfer. Historians still argue whether this was religious practice, economic ritual, or early superstition. But one thing is certain, and no one dug up those bones, not even during famine, not even when space ran low. They kept the debt curse separate, like a firewall, a warning. Some locals referred to them as the bound, as in bound to the world, not free to move on, not free to forget. One particularly disturbing inscription on a lead seal reads, "He dies twice, who dies in debt." That line alone appears on over a dozen ossuary boxes. You wonder what kind of lives these people led. A butcher who took too much credit, a farmer who borrowed seed and lost it to frost, a widow taxed beyond endurance. The records don't say. The ledgers list numbers, not faces. But the curses, those are personal. Some are full of rage. He took my bread. Let his blood freeze. Others are strange and sorrowful. May I taste salt again when the scales are righted. One is simply, she knows. No context, no further markings. Just the phrase, etched so deep it scarred the stone. A quirky tradition tied to these debt curses is the use of coin mouths. Bodies were sometimes buried with a coin not on the eyes, not under the tongue, but lodged directly in the clenched teeth, not as payment for passage, like the Greek obol. This was different. These coins were often bent, burned, or defaced. Some had holes drilled through them, some were split in half. A few had Latin etched along the edge, spes ultima, final hope. The belief was that the mouth, locked on the coin, held the debt in place. It couldn't escape. If the coin was removed, the curse became free-floating, looking for a new debtor to cling to. Of course, the church denounced all of this, officially, but quietly. Some priests participated in the rituals, because they too feared the spread of cursed debts. There are records of priests blessing iron lids on debtor crypts, reciting short Latin prayers not found in any formal canon. One reads, "May he forget the weight of coin." Another, let not his hunger follow the living. These weren't absolutions. They were more like appeasements, spiritual hush money. You pause at a low arch, where a bundle of parchment lies sealed in wax, preserved remarkably well by the cold. Inside is a name, Reno, no last name, just the initials RL, and beside it, a crude sketch of what looks like scales, uneven, one side heavier, and below, another phrase I tried. That's all. Just those two words. You imagine Reno, desperate, scraping together bread, spinning lies to lenders, watching doors close on his family. And when he died, someone took the time to write this, not to forgive him, just to record him, so that maybe one day someone would read it and understand he didn't mean to vanish in debt. It just happened. In later centuries, when the city expanded and renovations were made, several workers refused to enter these particular tunnels. Reports say their tools went missing, their candles extinguished. One man said he saw handprints in the soot on the walls too high to be from any living man. A letter from 1738 describes a contractor who tried to remove a debtor's ossuary to make space for wine storage. He lasted 1 week before falling ill with what he described as dreams that bite. When he died, they found coins scattered around his bed. No one admitted placing them. Some of the most feared curse jars were said to be made of green glass, delicate, sharp-edged, and sealed with wax and bone dust. Only 4 have ever been recovered intact. None have been opened. One resides in a museum, placed behind 4 panes of glass. Its label worn, but even now, curators refuse to display it without layers of separation, not because it's valuable, because it's unwanted. You can feel it just looking at it, like it wants to return to the dirt, like the curse inside is sighing, patiently, waiting for the seal to weaken. It's easy to forget that medieval people believed in the spiritual echo of transactions. That debt was not just financial, but moral. To owe someone was to carry their name inside you. To die with that weight unresolved meant the name became part of your afterlife. That's why curses mattered not as revenge, but as a warning to others. Don't forget me. Don't forgive them. And above all, don't spend what isn't settled. You crouch now at the base of a broken shelf, bones piled neatly, too neatly, and among them, a ring. Not valuable, just iron. Inscribed inside with a single phrase in Latin memone. I remember, you slip it on your finger without thinking, and then stop, because the air shifts, the silence deepens, something just notices. You take it off, gently, you place it back, and whisper, I never saw you. You walk out of the catacombs slowly, not because you're afraid, but because it feels wrong to hurry. These people died owing, but they left behind more than debt. They left behind memories shaped like metal, like jars, like words carved deep into stone by hands that trembled not from fear but from having no other choice. You step now into a crumbling quarter of a medieval city once known for its apothecaries, its plague wards, and oddly enough, its dentists. Though the term is generous, these were not clean, white-smocked professionals, but robed figures with pliers blackened from years of fire and use, working in dim stalls that smelled of herbs and meat, and something you couldn't name. And in this district, if you followed the whispers just right, you'd hear about the silver teeth. Not decorative, not healing, not for vanity. These were teeth pried from corpses, sometimes while the grave was still fresh, teeth that gleamed too brightly, that were rumored to curse the mouths they entered, and perhaps worse, curse the mouths that dared to speak their stories aloud. You find one now, resting in a rusted tray in an abandoned drawer. It's small, molar-shaped, heavier than it should be, and strange too because someone's etched something into the root, a spiral. No dentist would do that. No sane one, anyway. But it wasn't always dentists who harvested them. Sometimes it was grave robbers. Other times, physicians desperate for coin. And, occasionally, it was the bereaved those who couldn't afford to bury their dead. So they took what value they could, but the silver teeth. Those were different. Those were buried with intention. Historians still argue whether the practice had origins in alchemy, necromancy, or economic despair. One theory claims the silver was thought to preserve the soul, to keep it from decaying fully, to delay the return to dust. Another darker theory suggests the teeth were placed not to preserve, but to bind. That, in certain cases, the deceased was suspected of malice, a poisoner, a traitor, a war criminal. The silver was forced into their mouth to lock in their words, their confessions, their secrets. The idea was that if their words could not decay, then neither could they return. But, of course, silver has value, and where there is value, there are thieves. And where there are thieves, there are stories. One such story comes from the port town of Lear. A man named Corvin, a night watchman turned gravedigger, was known to live valuables off the newly dead, but his crowning theft was a set of silver teeth from a noblewoman accused of heresy. He pried them free with a fishhook within a week. He claimed the teeth were speaking to him at night, not in his ears, but in his jaw. He said his own teeth began to ache in rhythm with a voice he could not locate. His tongue bled, his gums blackened, and when he finally tried to sell the silver to a smith, the pieces were rejected for being too warm to hold. Corvin died in a riverbed, jaw shattered. The teeth were never recovered. Quirky detail in some apothecaries' records: silver was believed to absorb ailments, to draw them out of the body. That's why it was used in amulets, and sometimes even sewn into garments for the sick. But what happens when silver absorbs death itself? What happens when it's placed in the mouth of someone who died unclean, unrepentant, or unfinished? You begin to see how the metal stops being metal and becomes memory. Condensed, concentrated, toxic, and yet people kept using them, whether from ignorance, desperation, or defiance. Silver teeth found their way into the mouths of the living. Smugglers wore them for disguise. Mercenaries wore them for intimidation. One mad poet in Saxony had 6 installed voluntarily, believing they would let him speak like the dead. He wrote in tongues for months, then stopped writing altogether. His last poem was carved onto the wall of his rented room and read, "I swallowed a name that swallowed me." The landlord sealed the room and never rented it again. One recovered silver tooth from the 15th century bears a series of tiny dots around its base too orderly to be random, too precise for age wear. Linguists speculate it could be a form of early cipher, or musical notation, or simply a mark of ownership. But no one can crack it. The tooth is kept in a lead box, wrapped in salt-soaked cloth, and stored in a locked case at a private archive. It's not on display. The archivist who cataloged it claimed his molars began to itch after handling it. No one else has opened the box since. You run your tongue over your own teeth now, suddenly aware of their presence, of how they hold your words, your history, your grief. Imagine if one of them didn't belong to you. Imagine if it belonged to someone else, someone who'd been buried, someone who hadn't quite finished what they started. And imagine that every word you spoke passed through that tooth like breath through a broken keyhole. That's why the myth of the speaking teeth endures, not because of one dramatic haunting, but because of the slow accumulation of uncanny details. A merchant who stammers for weeks after biting into a piece of bread with a silver shard. A child who claims her grandfather's smile was full of someone else. A surgeon who removes a silver molar and dies that night, suffocating on air. The records are sparse, the names are fuzzy, but the pattern, it's unmistakable. And then there's the phenomenon of teeth returning. Cases in which buried silver was later found in unexpected places on the steps of churches, in the mouths of animals, even embedded in the roots of trees. In one village, a priest discovered a tooth resting on the pulpit. No one confessed to placing it there. It was removed. The next day, it reappeared inside the chalice. The priest left. The parish closed. The building collapsed during a mild storm. Only the tooth remained, lodged in the stone where the altar had stood. You wonder now what it means to bury something inside a person. Not physically, but symbolically. A curse doesn't always need a name. Sometimes it just needs a vessel. A thing small enough to go unnoticed, strong enough to last. Silver lasts. It tarnishes, yes, but it resists rot. It shines. It endures. And if it's been somewhere it shouldn't have, it remembers. You kneel by the corner of an old graveyard, your hand brushing aside dead leaves and earth. Beneath them, a box, small, blackened by time, inside a tooth, silver, slightly curved, marked with a spiral too fine for any human finger to have drawn. You don't touch it, but you feel it, like a word at the back of your throat that you never chose, waiting to be spoken. You close the box, rebury it, not out of fear, but because you're beginning to understand. Some curses are not about revenge, they're about return. A silver tooth in a stolen mouth, whispering, not with vengeance, but with memory that refuses to stay buried. And the ones who wear them, they don't become cursed immediately. No, they just start to forget. First small things, then names, then themselves, until only the tooth remembers, until only it speaks. You move now beyond walls, beyond graves, beyond anything shaped by hand or hammer, and into the wild. A forest, older than language, thicker than memory. The kind of place where paths vanish behind you, where sunlight filters through the trees like it's thinking twice. Locals call it the eating forest, though the name doesn't appear on maps, not because it's been erased, but because it never needed to be written. Everyone nearby knows where not to go. They say the forest doesn't take the greedy or the lost. It takes the ones who look for something, the ones who think there's treasure buried beneath the roots. And if you trace the stories back far enough, and you always can. If you're stubborn, you arrive at the tale of the vanished knight and the gold he was meant to guard. It begins in the 1300s, with a man named Adalric, a knight who returned from campaign with more gold than a man like him should have. He was neither noble by birth nor blessed by the church, yet suddenly he held enough wealth to purchase a keep, an estate, and even the favor of suspicious kings. He built nothing. He married no one. Instead, he retreated into the forest with only 3 trusted men and disappeared behind the trees. They say he buried the gold there not all at once, but in stages, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked into stone-lined pits, sealed with wax and prayers no one recognized. And one by one, his men stopped returning, when finally only Adalric remained. He was last seen digging something far too deep, muttering in a tongue that sounded like prayer, but felt more like warning. Historians still argue whether Adalric was real, or the invention of peasants trying to explain disappearances and strange sounds in the woods. But here's what's odd. Records from a nearby abbey mention a knight fitting his description requesting final rites in advance. The priest refused. The knight reportedly left without anger, but gave a single coin in exchange for the rejection. That coin, preserved today, is badly tarnished, but the etching remains. Not a king's face, not a cross, but a circle of trees, and in the middle, a single open eye. The abbey's candle room burned down 3 weeks later. No cause was found. The forest around where Adalric vanished grew stranger over time. Birds stopped nesting. Wolves wouldn't enter. Even hunters began avoiding it, though the deer were plentiful. Stories spread of paths shifting when you weren't looking, of distant drums that sounded like heartbeat, of seeing your own shadow move in the wrong direction. One woodsman, returning with an axe that had turned entirely black overnight, claimed he heard a voice from the roots that said only one word, stay. He never went back. His axe, however, was later found buried in a tree trunk 3 miles from where he said he left it. Still embedded, still black. Then there are the treasure seekers. Because there are always treasure seekers, not knights or pilgrims, but modern men with maps and metal detectors, driven not by greed but by obsession. Every few years, someone arrives with new theories. They measure tree rings, they dig, they bring drones, and then they stop. Some leave without explanation. Others leave but don't really return. Found later in towns far away, quiet, dazed, mumbling about the forest folding. One man simply dropped his detector mid-sweep, looked skyward, and whispered, "It's not buried, it's awake." He never worked again. A quirky note from a 17th century botanist describes strange plant life in the region: trees with bark that bruises when touched, moss that grows in geometric patterns, sap that glows faintly under moonlight. He collected samples, sent them to a colleague in Prague. The colleague died of infection after opening the crate. His last written words, "This is not plant." The locals have their own rituals. They leave small offerings at the edge of the forest: milk, salt, honey, never inside, always along the border. No one is told to, they just do. Some carve wooden figures with closed eyes and hang them on branches facing outward. If you ask why, they'll shrug and say it's to keep the forest full. One old woman told a researcher, if it eats you, it's because you were looking for something, so just don't look. But what is the treasure? Gold, jewels, a lost relic, or something else entirely? Something Adalric didn't hide, but fed some theorists suggest the knight found something in the forest. Not buried wealth, but buried will, a consciousness too vast and patient to chase, but willing to wait. And in exchange for protection, or perhaps survival, Adalric offered it secrecy, guardianship, burial not as concealment, but as containment. The forest itself becomes a kind of living vault. Trees planted in patterns no one notices until they're too deep inside. Stones that hum if tapped at the right frequency, and always, the sense of being watched not by something hostile, but by something disappointed. Like the forest expects better from you. Like it's seen 1,000 versions of you before. The diggers, the wanderers, the ones who thought they were clever. One surviving document from a Benedictine scribe describes a wood that remembers footsteps and advises travelers to walk backward when leaving, lest their path close behind them. The same account mentions a knight who offered his own name and coin to a grove of trees, after which no hound could follow him. A metaphor, maybe. Or maybe Adalric didn't just bury treasure. Maybe he became it. You stand now at the edge of the forest. The wind doesn't move here. The grass leans toward the trees. You see a path, barely visible, like an indentation in the world. You could follow it. You could bring tools. You could call it research. But you remember the stories of those who looked for something and were looked at in return. You know better now. You know that the forest doesn't guard what's hidden. It is what's hidden. And the treasure was never meant to be found, only protected. You back away, slowly, eyes on the trees, because somewhere, deep in that silence, a heartbeat still echoes against roots that have tasted metal and prayer, and the slow decay of men who thought they could dig without consequence. And somewhere, beneath those roots, the gold sleeps, not forgotten, just waiting. Because the curse was never gold. The curse was curiosity. You step out of the forest and into the soot-dark hearth of a centuries-old English cottage, where the floorboards groan like old bones, and the air smells faintly of salt and copper. Beneath the bricks of the fireplace, hidden in the ash or behind loose stones, you begin to find them bottles, small, cloudy, ancient things, not wine, not medicine, something far stranger. They're stoppered tightly with wax, sometimes sealed in lead, and almost always filled with a mess of impossible contents: bent nails, human hair, yellowed fingernails, clumps of salt, and in some cases coins. Always just one, and always old. These are witch bottles, not for witches, but against them. And the coins inside, they aren't offerings, they're anchors. Cursed coins to trap intentions, to reflect harm, to twist theft back upon the thief, and sometimes, if the curse was strong enough, to pass it forward. Witch bottles appeared in English households as early as the 16th century, but their roots go deeper. Across Europe, people feared magic. Yes, but they feared subtle magic more. Not fireballs or hexes, but whispers, ill wishes, jealous glances, a neighbor's muttered insult, and so they fought silence with silence. They buried bottles near doorways, hearths, thresholds, places where energy crossed, and at the heart of many of these glass traps was a single coin, defaced, darkened, inscribed, sometimes not with value, but with intent. Because if someone sent you a curse, this coin would absorb it, or return it, or turn it inward. You hold one now, found behind a cottage wall that hadn't been opened in 200 years. It's a short, squat bottle, half full of liquid that no one should dare test. Suspended in that murky fluid floats a bent silver coin, punctured through the center as though someone tried to silence it with a nail. You feel the weight of it before you even lift it, heavy for its size, not because of its composition, but because of its history. Historians still debate whether these bottles were meant to curse others or protect the self. In some folk records, they're called blessing jars. In others, traps for tongues. But most agree the coin was crucial. Without it, the bottle was just superstition. With it, the bottle became an intention given form, a curse reversed, an echo caught and suspended forever. One 17th century herbalist manual even includes a recipe for witch's vinegar, a mixture of urine, rosemary, and iron shavings, poured over a coin and sealed in a bottle, then buried beneath the threshold with a whispered phrase, "Let no harm pass, who would cause it." A quirky belief attached to these bottles held that the coin inside should never match the region's currency. It had to be foreign, outdated, or otherwise out of place, to ensure it confused the curse and deflected it away from the rightful inhabitant. Some bottles held Roman coins, others used hand-forged discs of unknown metal. In one unearthed example, the coin had no markings, just a faint spiral engraved with pinpricks, like a maze without walls. The bottle it came from was discovered in a house where, according to parish records, every male child died before their 7th birthday. After the bottle was removed, the next child lived. The bottle was never broken, just moved. It now resides in a museum basement, kept in a padded drawer labeled unknown function. And then there are the stories of coins that escaped. Bottles shattered in storms, bottles dug up by mistake, bottles cracked open by curious hands. In each case, the coin inside was removed, sometimes pawned, sometimes spent, and always regretted. A merchant in Devon reportedly bought a bottle as part of an antique lot. He kept the coin as a novelty. Within weeks, his dog vanished. His crops failed. He began to mutter names no one recognized. The coin was eventually melted down, but the crucible cracked during the process, splashing molten silver across the wall, where it left a hand-shaped stain that never cleaned off. The merchant sold the house. The new owner found a second bottle, this one intact, and buried it deep beneath the garden. The house has been quiet since. You begin to see the pattern. The bottle isn't the curse, the coin is. The bottle simply keeps it still, like a scabbard around a blade. And the curse itself, it's not rage. It's memory, concentrated, distilled, made tangible. Someone once hated strongly enough, or feared deeply enough, to trap that feeling inside a shape. Not to destroy, just to store, and maybe forget. One particularly unsettling case comes from Yorkshire, where a house built in the 1400s revealed not one, not two, but 13 witch bottles hidden beneath the floor, each in a different room, each containing a single coin, all minted in different decades. The layout suggests an elaborate defensive strategy, as though the house's occupants were sealing off every point of entry, not from burglars, but from attention. One of the coins bore the inscription Quietus in Verbo, meaning, loosely, peace in silence. No family ever stayed longer than 3 years in that house. It burned down in 1824 during a dry storm. Fire consumed every room except the cellar, where the bottles had been stored. They were found unbroken, sitting quietly among the ash. And then there are the bottles buried intentionally in other people's homes. These were curses by proxy, planted beneath floorboards during renovations, tossed into garden beds during visits, hidden in chimney flues. The intent was simple: attach misfortune to a space, not a person. Let the house itself become the carrier. One woman in Wiltshire reportedly cursed a neighbor who'd accused her of theft by slipping a witch bottle through a cracked window frame. The neighbor's son fell ill. The cow went dry. The woman was eventually accused of witchcraft, but the bottle was never found. Only later, during demolition, did workers uncover it, sealed behind a fireplace, still intact. The coin inside had been folded in half like a hinge. No one could explain how. Even the church, in some corners, acknowledged the existence of these practices, not openly, but letters from bishops occasionally include odd requests to remove the object from beneath the vestry or cleanse the threshold with salt and scripture. One priest in Sussex kept a coin on his person at all times, sealed inside a small glass capsule. He claimed it was from a bottle found during a fire cleanup. He believed it absorbed anger. He died peacefully. The coin was buried with him, or so they say. You wonder now what happens when a curse is sealed so long that it forgets what it was meant to do. Does it grow stronger in confusion or weaker in purpose? Some folklorists suggest that if the coin loses memory of its curse, it begins to seek, looking for something familiar, someone to belong to. That's why some old houses feel heavier than they should, why some coins feel too warm, not because of heat, but because of hunger. You sit now beside a hearth long cold, holding a bottle not yet broken. The coin inside turns slowly, as if stirred by something unseen. You consider opening it, just to see, just to know, but you don't. Not because you're afraid of what's inside, but because you're afraid of what might come out confused. You rebury the bottle beneath the bricks, seal the floor, whisper a word you don't quite understand. Some treasures aren't meant to be found. Some coins aren't meant to be spent. And some curses aren't loud. They're quiet, contained, but only barely. You walk now through the low stone cloisters of a monastery that shouldn't exist anymore, not because of war or fire, but because of forgetting. Built into the side of a moss-covered hill, it leans as though ashamed, its arches hunched like monks in permanent prayer. No guidebooks mention it, no modern roads lead to it, yet here it stands, carved into memory by habit more than history, and beneath the quiet chanting that once echoed through its halls, lies a scandal no scripture could cleanse a king's unpaid debt, hidden not by diplomats or scribes, but by monks, men sworn to God, sworn to silence, who instead took on the burden of a curse to keep their lie buried, not to protect the king, but to protect the world from the price of his betrayal. It begins with war, as most quiet horrors do. A king, his name scrubbed from every official chronicle, but half remembered in the footnotes of frustrated historians, owes gold, a lot of it, to mercenaries, to other kings, to a group of men so feared that their ledgers were bound in skin, and rather than pay, he hides the truth, not in exile, not in confession, but in trust. He sends the relics of his treasury coins, scepters, signets, rings into the care of a devout but crumbling monastic order, not to hold, to seal. The debt isn't cancelled. It's compressed, pressed into chests, buried under the chapel floor, wrapped in prayer and something else, something not quite holy. Historians still argue whether the monks knew what they were doing. Some suggest they believed they were safeguarding the relics for redemption. Others claim they understood the debt was poisoned, that the act of hiding it made them complicit, and that complicity called something forth, something that didn't want gold, but wanted accountability. One monk's journal survives. It begins with Psalms. It ends with a single line repeated over and over for 10 pages. We have taken what cannot be held. It knows. You descend now beneath the chapel, past where tourists would stop if tourists ever came here. The crypt smells of old iron and wet stone, and in its center lies a sunken grate. Beneath it, a chamber sealed with blackened mortar, reinforced with lead bands. No door, just a window into something that shouldn't have shape. Inside are the remnants of chests, rotted wood, twisted hinges, gold coins fused together like congealed wax, not scattered, not stolen, just untouched. And if you listen long enough, some say, you'll hear chanting, not in Latin, in a rhythm that doesn't match any known hymn, a syllabic cycle that sounds less like prayer and more like reminder. A quirky detail survives in the form of a wax tablet found tucked into the monastery's bell tower, preserved under centuries of dust. On it, a crude drawing of the king, faceless, surrounded by tally marks, no numbers, no dates, just marks, over 200. Beneath it, the phrase, each breath we took without payment. The monks, it seems, didn't just bury the debt, they began living it. As if by sealing the king's sin, they absorbed his guilt, and it changed them. One account from a nearby village tells of a monk who wandered into town during a famine, his robe torn, his mouth sewn shut with silver thread. He held out a single coin, trembling, but said nothing. The baker who took the coin fell into a sleep that lasted 6 days. When he woke, he couldn't stop weeping. No one asked what the monk had wanted. He'd vanished, but the coin remained, blackened around the edges, too hot to touch. And then there's the matter of the madness. The monastery's records decline in clarity after the king's deposit. Sermons become shorter, Choir notes become erratic, margins fill with symbols that don't match any known script. Eventually, the monks stop writing altogether, but not all at once. The ink just thins. Words drift apart. Pages grow blank, until the final ledger is nothing but empty parchment. A silence so complete it feels deliberate, manufactured, like they weren't forgetting they were being forgotten. Even the architecture begins to betray its purpose. One hallway loops back into itself. One stair leads nowhere. Windows that once looked onto gardens now reflect only stone. And the chapel bell, melted partially on one side, never rings. Not from damage, from choice. The rope is gone. Cut, as though they feared calling something back that had finally gone quiet. Yet the curse never left. It just changed form. In the early 1800s, during a short-lived restoration attempt, a worker found a ring sealed in a compartment beneath the altar, gold, plain, but inscribed on the inside with a warning paid in silence. Collected in thought, the man who found it young, skeptical, placed it on his finger as a joke. Within a week, he stopped sleeping. He insisted the walls whispered numbers to him. Not voices, just numbers. Unrelenting, he threw the ring into the sea. It washed ashore 2 towns south, in the hands of a priest who claimed to have dreamt of it the night before. You begin to understand now. The debt wasn't monetary. Not anymore. It became mental. A psychic ledger passed invisibly through time. The monks didn't just hide the gold. They tried to absorb the cost, but guilt doesn't dilute. It distills, becomes sharper, becomes math, and eventually, the equation solves itself by collecting not gold, but minds. Bit by bit, thought by thought, madness not as punishment, but as receipt. A modern scholar, who visited the site under false pretenses of architectural research, wrote in his notebook, "It's not the weight of the vault that crushes, it's the weight of what it implies. That silence is not forgiveness, it's interest." He left that night, barefoot, leaving behind all his belongings. His notebook was mailed anonymously to a university. Its pages had been reordered. They now count backward. You walk the monastery halls slowly, careful not to step on the cracked tiles. You feel the floor's tension, the way it presses back against your feet, like it remembers. And beneath it, still pulsing faintly, that debt, that failure. Not of one king, but of a system that believed gold could delay consequence. That belief itself was the curse. That's why the monks stopped singing. Not because they forgot the words, but because they finally understood them. You reach the door of the refectory, once a place of shared meals. Now, just dust and echo. A single spoon remains on a wooden bench, carved into its handle. Enough? You don't touch it. You don't breathe too hard, because you realize now, with a kind of slow horror, that the curse was never about treasure. The gold was just a conduit. The true curse was carried by the mind, the weight of secrecy, of complicity, of knowing what you've buried, and pretending it won't grow roots. You leave the monastery in silence. Behind you, the stones do not shift, but the wind does, slightly, like a ledger being turned, and you wonder if enough people forget a debt. Does that cancel it? Or does it simply wait for one person to remember just long enough for the curse to begin again? You're not sure what to expect when you enter the crumbling cell of an alchemist long dead, but it certainly isn't the silence. Not this kind. Not the kind that sticks to your skin like soot, as if the air itself has been burned clean of memory. The room, if you can still call it that, is no bigger than a stable, with scorched walls and rusted shelves sagging under the weight of glass vials, some cracked, some weeping unknown residue. In the corner lies a brazier choked with ash, beside a set of copper scales that tilt too far to one side despite holding nothing. You found the workspace of a man once known only by a single name, Alias. Not a nobleman, not a magician, an alchemist. But unlike the others who chased gold for greed or glory, Alias is remembered barely for chasing something far more dangerous. He wasn't trying to find cursed treasure. He was trying to create it. Historians still argue over what exactly gilt gold was supposed to be. Some call it metaphor, a parable about corrupted wealth. Others insist it was real, an alloy formed through ritual, intention, and loss. Elias believed you could bind emotion into metal, distill not just lead or copper, but shame. According to a single surviving manuscript attributed to him, titled Vita Inversa, he sought to forge coins infused not with value, but with memory so strong it cursed the one who held it. The process involved fire? Yes, but also sacrifice. Not human, at least not explicitly, but time, belief, and something harder to name. You couldn't just smelt, you had to confess. Speak the moment of betrayal into the molten ore. The longer the confession, the deeper the bind, the more personal, the more potent. He believed pain could be captured in silver. You find one such coin, hidden beneath a floorboard loose enough to betray secrets, but tight enough to resist casual notice. It's small, dull, nothing a thief would steal. But as soon as you touch it, your ears ring faintly. Not loud, not even unpleasant, just present. You feel, somehow, like you've interrupted a thought. That's what Alias intended. He believed cursed coins should think, in a way, not like people, but like wounds, that they should carry a bruise of the moment they were made, and that anyone who held them would feel the ache. Quirky details emerge from what remains of his writings notes in the margins of burned books, ink etched into glass with iron nails. He insisted that gilt gold should never be minted with faces, only blank surfaces. To give it a face was to give it sympathy. And sympathy, he wrote, would let it forget. The coins he made were featureless, but always marked along the edge with a single phrase, "I remember," or, in some later examples, "not forgiven." They weren't meant to be currency. They were meant to be traps, not for wealth, for conscience. And the result, no empire ever used his coins. No royal treasuries ever adopted them, but they survived, tucked into the folds of forgotten robes, hidden in wall crevices, swallowed, even, by monks who believed they were purifying their thoughts through punishment. One coin was found inside the skull of a skeleton, unearthed during a canal renovation in Bruges. Lodged between the jaw and cheekbone, no wounds, just a coin where no coin should be. Some believe Alias went mad. Others think he achieved something no one else dared. His final experiments moved beyond gold and into amalgamation silver mixed with powdered bone, lead mixed with burnt parchment inked with guilt. These materials were shaped not into coins, but into amulets, rings, even mirror frames. One ring, now housed in a private collection and kept under 5 layers of glass, bears the inscription, "Speak only what you'll die hearing." The last collector who tried it on vanished 2 days later. His apartment was found undisturbed, save for the mirror in the hallway cracked perfectly in the shape of a mouth. And then there's the rumor of the coin chain, an experiment Alias never completed, but described obsessively. It would involve 7 gilt coins, each forged from a different betrayal: abandonment, envy, theft, silence, cowardice, pride, and love, bound together in a ritual fire. They would create a chain not to bind others, but to bind yourself. A way to take your sins and make them heavier than you. To wear your wrongs so plainly that no curse could follow you anymore, because the curse would already be in you. The manuscript ends there. The chain, if ever made, was never found. But some say that's why Alias vanished, that he succeeded, and that the guilt swallowed him whole. You sit now on the floor of his crumbling cell, the air stiff with memory. You turn the coin over in your fingers and feel the echo of something deeply private. Not a scream, not a cry, just a soft, exhausted, "I'm sorry." Whether it belongs to Alias or to someone long before him doesn't matter. What matters is that it's still here. And you wonder, could such a coin actually be cursed? Could metal carry emotion? Could grief stain silver the way blood does? People who've held his coins report strange phenomena. Vivid dreams, sudden remorse, a recurring sense of being watched not by others, but by themselves. One woman claimed the coin whispered her mother's voice. Another refused to speak while it remained in her pocket. Some tossed theirs into rivers. Others locked them away. None could say exactly what the coin had done, only that something had changed. Not the world, them. You return the coin to its hiding place, not because you fear it, but because you respect it. Not every curse is punishment. Some are lessons too sharp to be taught any other way. Gilt gold was never about vengeance. It was about memory, about forcing someone to carry what they buried, to make forgetting impossible. Because some people don't need justice, they need a mirror that doesn't blink. As you rise, a breeze brushes through the cracked window, impossible, because no wind blows outside. The scales on the table shudder once. The ash in the brazier shifts as if something turned in its sleep. You don't run, you walk out, slow and careful, because now you understand Alias didn't forge curses to hurt others. He forged them to make sure they never escape themselves. And the most dangerous thing about a cursed coin isn't what it does to your luck, or your home, or your dreams. It's what it makes you remember, because once the coin is in your hand, there's no one else to blame. Just your reflection, just the weight, just the quiet voice that asks, are you still pretending you forgot? You return now to where it all began, not the first curse, nor the oldest treasure, but the simplest question buried under it all. What if the hoard was never meant to be found? What if the treasure wasn't hidden for protection, or greed, or fear, but as a form of containment? What if all the coins, bones, boxes, seals, and silent relics weren't buried to preserve wealth, but to bury something the world was not meant to unearth? You step through a foggy moorland at dusk, where sheep bleat faintly in the distance and the sky hangs heavy like a lid. Beneath your feet, the soil is thick with peat, preserving time the way amber traps flies. And in this land of soft sinking, legends rise like steam stories of buried kings who aren't asleep, but watching, of treasure that calls not to the brave, but to the weak, and of a single recurring phrase whispered across centuries, always the same, always unsigned, not lost, just guarded. It's here that you find a low mound, no marker, no inscription, just a curve in the earth too deliberate to be natural. The locals avoid it, say the grass grows faster here, but never flowers. That sheep refuse to graze too close. That compasses spin when you walk past it too slowly. It doesn't look like a tomb. It doesn't look like anything, but you kneel anyway. Brush your hand across the damp ground and find a single stone, round, smooth, with something carved faintly into its center, a circle of teeth. You don't touch it, not because it feels cursed, because it feels aware. Historians still argue whether these mounds mark ancient burial sites, lost treasure vaults, or forgotten rituals, but one thing they agree on is that too many of them remain unopened, not because we haven't found them, but because something in us knows not to try. The Norse called them hogger, and warned that digging them disturbed not the dead, but the balance. In medieval Wales, such hills were said to be guarded by not sleeping, a term so deliberately vague that it chilled even the monks who copied it. And one 15th century chronicler wrote that the treasure within was never meant to enrich. It was meant to hold something still. There's one tale from Ireland that stays with you, about a farmer who uncovered a small bronze box while digging peat. It wasn't locked, just sealed with wax and cloth. Inside coins, yes, but also a stone eye and a folded piece of vellum with the words, "If it breathes, it begins." The farmer sealed it again and reburied it, but from that night on, his dream spoke with his voice, but not his words. He began writing things he didn't remember learning, drawing maps of places that no longer existed, and when he died, his hands were clenched around a coin no one could remove. His descendants refused to speak of it. The mound remains untouched. The unsettling thing is not that people find these treasures, it's that they find them again. Coins reappearing after being melted, boxes reburied a dozen times, teeth that surface in streams. They're not resisting destruction, they're resisting absence. The curse, then, isn't malevolent. It's structural. These items were made to be here, not used, not claimed, just held. And when someone removes them, the world notices. Something leans. Something begins to echo. A curious fragment from a Carthusian scribe hints that the true curse of treasure is not in its power, but in its persistence. That each object remembers not only who touched it, but why. That it binds not to flesh, but to intention. The greedy, the mournful, the curious, the guilty. These motives are not lost. They are preserved in metal, in ash, in the dark iron blood of the earth. And if too many of these objects are pulled from the ground, too many intentions awaken, not all of them human. You sit beside the mound now, dusk pulling its dark hood over the landscape. The fog curls close, but never touches the hill. You don't need to know what's inside. You already do. Not the contents, the purpose. It was never meant to be opened, because it was never a vault. It was a seal, not to keep something in, not to keep us out, but to keep the balance. And balance, once disturbed, does not scream. It whispers, soft, relentless, like breath against your neck when no one's behind you. In the end, all cursed treasure is the same, not because of what it holds, but because of what it waits for. You think of the knight who vanished into the woods, the monk who sealed silence into stone, the widow who cursed her dowry not with anger, but with sorrow, the bottle buried under the hearth, the tooth resting in the wall. None of them wanted revenge. They wanted containment. They wanted silence to stay sealed. And what breaks that silence? A coin lifted, a box opened, a question asked. The curse, then, is us. We are the disturbance, the searchers, the ones who can't leave mystery alone, who dig because we think what's buried belongs to us. And maybe that's why the curses linger, because they're not punishments, they're responses, echoes, mirrors of our own refusal to let sleeping things lie. They don't need to chase us. We come to them. So you rise now. Step away from the mound. The fog parts gently as you pass, not welcoming, not resisting, just watching. You feel the weight of all you've seen, all the stories, the whispered phrases carved in iron, the names lost in jars, the memories soaked into silver. You carry it like a bag of coins you never asked for but can never spend. And you realize you've been part of the curse since the beginning, not because you touched anything, but because you listened. And once you've listened, you can't pretend not to know. You're still here. That's good. That means the story didn't pull you in too deep. Or maybe it did, and you found your way back. Either way, this is the quiet part now. The part where the candles burn lower, where the air settles, where nothing moves, but everything listens. You let your thoughts slow, like water losing its ripple. Let the names fade. Let the symbols soften. The teeth, the coins, the buried jars, they're no longer stories you hold. They're just echoes now, settling back into stillness. You imagine the old soil closing again, gently, like a book returning to the shelf. You imagine the coins cooling, the bones resting, the whispers finding their way back into the stone. There's peace there, not because the curses are gone, but because they're understood. They weren't chasing, they were remembering. And you remembered too, and that's enough. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the dark around you thicken in a soft way, like velvet. Maybe turn on that fan now, or let the night air in. Let the silence come back, not the heavy kind, but the safe kind, the kind that doesn't need to hide anything. And if, by chance, you ever find a coin where it shouldn't be, or a box no one remembers burying, leave it. Let it stay forgotten. Let the world stay balanced. Close your eyes now. Let the story fade. You're home.